There is this common consensus that the next Fire Emblem remake will be of Fire Emblem 4 Genealogy of the Holy War. I personally do not agree with this and think that it is far more likely that we will see a remake of Fire Emblem 6 The Binding Blade next, and my reasons for such are as follows. The co-director of Echoes has shown plenty of interest in doing Fire Emblem 6 as a remake, as well as the fact that Roy just has massive amounts of popularity thanks to Smash Bros. Melee and now Smash Bros. 4. And if Fire Emblem 6 is the next remake, there is plenty to get excited about. There is a lot of things in Fire Emblem 6 that I'm really looking forward to seeing finally be brought over to the West in an official release, such as how Zephiel is characterized, the way that they'll change the gameplay up, and most importantly, how they'll handle the 3 major problems a Fire Emblem 6 remake will face. As with any remake, there is the struggle of both trying to modernize the game for a new audience, as well as helping to retain those who played it before and may want to experience the game again with a new coat of paint. In essence, you can't please everybody, but there are changes that you can make in order to make a compromise. There are plenty of remakes out there that I could draw as examples, but for now, I'm just going to leave it pretty simple. Fire Emblem hasn't had the best track record with remakes. Most of the time they are too hung up on trying to stay too true to the original that they end up misstepping and creating games that feel archaic and very dated despite the updated presentation. You can see a lot of examples of this in just reading pretty much any official review of Fire Emblem Echoes. But compared to the original Gaiden, Fire Emblem 6 suffers from a very different set of problems. And in this video, I aim to discuss what those problems are. Gameplay related issues in Fire Emblem 6 can all be grouped under the same kind of umbrella, as it shares many of the same gameplay problems that most older Fire Emblem games do, including having large maps that take hours to complete, huge clumps of enemies all of the same type that only serve to soak up time, large amounts of reinforcements, strange map gimmicks, such as Fog of War mixed with Desert. That one is terrible, by the way. And all manner of archaic and weird design choices. Seriously, why the hell can't thieves promote in this game? As with the original Gaiden, gameplay features such as incredibly imbalanced terrain bonuses, massive difficulty spikes, and a bad RNG system are all characteristics that FE6 has. It also has a habit, much like Shadow Dragon and its remake, of throwing massive amounts of units at you as a result to diversify gameplay on repeat playthroughs. The issue, however, is that you end up with a cast way too big for you to realistically use. This leads to the player having more units and characters than they know what to do with. The game gives you 7 paladins, only 3 of which I would really call useful in any capacity. This massive cast of characters leads to a huge imbalance and disconnect between what units are good and what aren't. Just look no further than how much of a meme Rutger has become because of his 101% crit rate. That's absolutely ridiculous and can only really be achieved by him, making subsequent runs without him all the more hard on the player. In essence, you're given the illusion of choice, and I hope that in a Fire Emblem 6 remake they tone down the amount of units you get, or perhaps put in a way to circumvent the fact that you get so many units, and perhaps make more of them useful in their own ways. Because as it stands right now, there are plenty of units who I'm sure go completely unused on most players' playthroughs. A big concern a lot of Fire Emblem fans, especially Western Fire Emblem fans, are going to have going into Fire Emblem 6 or a remake of it is how much it will draw from Fire Emblem 7. There are certainly aspects of Fire Emblem 7 that make it into the true prequel that it is, but at the same time, a lot of retcon and canonization that comes from Fire Emblem 7 directly clashes with that of Fire Emblem 6, and there are plenty of big ones, but the one I want to draw the most examples from is Lyn. I know how rich this must be coming from me, considering... Oh, baby, baby, come on! Oh, baby, baby, come on! Oh, baby, baby, come on! But it's not like she's actually important to the series at all, or significant in any way. Clearly that's not it. Clearly it's just me finding her hot.
Yes! Definitely!
Regardless, Lyn was a creation purely of FE7, and, well, she was designed with the intent of being and staying in Fire Emblem 7, as there are plenty of things, especially in the Japanese version of Fire Emblem 7, that allow you to circumvent Lyn as a character for the most part. And it's honestly quite upsetting because a lot of Western Fire Emblem fans are going to want closure to Lyn's arc, as both Eliwood and Hector appear in Binding Blade in some capacity and serve major pivotal roles in terms of moving the plots forward despite only appearing in the early chapters of the game, Hector especially in this regard. But regardless of how they incorporate Lyn, it's going to have to retcon something regarding FE7. And this something that it would possibly retcon is Lyn's future daughter. See, in Fire Emblem 7, Lyn has a possibility of 4 husbands. Eliwood I'm going to discount right off the bat, mostly because his relationship with Ninian and arguably his relationship with Fiora make far more sense within the context of FE7's story, especially regarding Ninian. As for Kent, well, Kent is obviously the one that causes the least damage, but at the same time, it's also the least likely of Lyn's possible husbands, for many reasons apart from just the fact that, well, Kent and Lyn just don't share that much screen time together. Lyn's last 2 possible husbands, Wrath and Hector, come with them a huge set of problems, as both of them have canon daughters that are hired during Binding Blade, these being Sue and Lilina respectively. Now, obviously this creates a problem, because Fire Emblem 7 players will want to know what happened to Lyn. She is a huge part of the series, and definitely the First Lord for many players, myself included. And name-dropping her in some way or giving her a cameo in the same vein as Hector and Eliwood would be important for these players and would feel very satisfying to see closure for one of their favorite characters. At the same time, however, this creates a paradox in the sense that it would have to canonize one of Lyn's 2 possible pairings. Because both Sue and Lilina are present in Roy's army, she would have to have a discussion with one of them if she is one of their mothers. The underlying problem with this is how much Fire Emblem relies on player choice when it comes to romantic pairings. The support system is hugely vindictive of this, and there are very few canon pairings throughout the series, and whatever pairings there are that are canon are usually done so as a plot device or if they're explicitly stated. The ones offhand that come to mind include Pent and Louise, Sigurd and Deirdre, and I guess you can argue for Chrom and Sumia, but there are also plenty of other pairings for Chrom as well. Anyways, canonizing one of Lyn's 2 possible romantic partners would take a huge amount of player choice out of the equation and would upset at least one side of the fanbase, whether or not that's with Wrath or with Hector. And while I certainly have my own preference, I made an entire video about that if you're curious. The inclusion of things from FE7 into FE6 would cause for a huge amount of rewrites and retcons to be made, especially when concerning both Lilina's parentage and Zephiel as a character as well, which is a shame because Zephiel is arguably one of the best written villains in the series. And it is this fan service towards Fire Emblem 7 that concerns me a lot for the story of this game. And do you know what else concerns me for the story of this game? Is the nature of what they did with Shadows of Valentia. When you consider Fire Emblem Echoes Shadows of Valentia, Gaiden had a very poor story to begin with. It was very simple and very of its time and very characteristic of the technical limitations that the NES and Famicom had. However, going into Binding Blade, which is a much more complete game, I think fixing the story would be more akin to fixing something that isn't broken. When you look at Echoes and you consider what it achieved and what it didn't achieve, they were so hung up on trying to preserve Gaiden's experience that the biggest change they made to the gameplay was just upping the growth rates. Apart from that, the freeform dungeon crawling is great, but otherwise the game is mostly the same as it was back in the 1980s. And honestly, it scares me that they might try and do the same with FE6. Fire Emblem 6 suffers from a ton of aforementioned mechanical problems with its gameplay that need to be addressed. However, I feel like they'll be too hung up on preserving the experience and focus way too much on fixing the story, something that FE6 doesn't really need because Fire Emblem 6 has a great story in its own right. While not the best or most original as Fire Emblem games go, it is far more serviceable and far more in depth than the original Gaiden story was, and does not need the help that a remake would give it. There are plenty of better things that the remake's time and effort should be spent on that aren't the story. Perhaps I'm counting my chickens before they hatch here. Since we've only had one game under the Echoes moniker, it's pretty hard to say if there's going to be a developing pattern of only fixing story and leaving the gameplay as close to the original as possible. It might just be too early to say. Although I really hope that they don't touch the story going into FE6 because it needs those mechanical improvements a lot. Before I go, I figure I should mention this because I'm certain I will get a lot of comments about it, and that is the idea that Fire Emblem 6 and Fire Emblem 7 will be combined into one single game, much like how Genealogy of the Holy War had its Generation 1 and Generation 2 split. I personally love this idea and think it could do a lot to fix the mechanical issues, at least in terms of terrain bonuses and RNG. It will also address the continuity errors such as Lelena's parentage, by allowing players to still keep their pairings variable within Fire Emblem 7 and then that carrying over to inheritance in Fire Emblem 6, much like how it did in Genealogy or in Awakening. And I think this is a great idea as it will allow for further unit customization and give the game an insane amount of replayability. There is, however, two big problems with this idea. Firstly, while addressing the retcon and the mechanical issues of Fire Emblem 6, a Fire Emblem 7 combined remake with Fire Emblem 6 still suffers the issue of trying to fix what isn't broken, only now on a much grander scale because we now have 2 games and basically 3 contained story arcs to deal with all at once. Secondly, by combining 2 full Fire Emblem games into one single experience, you run the risk of creating a game that is over 80 chapters long and may even break into the triple digits when you count Gaiden chapters. That is frankly a huge amount of game considering most Fire Emblem games are 40 chapters at most and tend to average at about 30 if that. Considering all of this, this project would be not only ambitious, but sizable and would take a ton of manpower, resources, and voice acting talents to make it fully realized. While I think the product would be amazing if handled correctly, there is just so many moving pieces that I think this type of project would be incredibly overly ambitious and maybe just a little too risky given its scope. What are your thoughts on the likelihood of a possible Fire Emblem 6 remake? I would love to hear them down in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, why not like, subscribe, and maybe even share it with a friend. I personally think an FE6 remake is very likely and we'll probably see it as the next one. Sorry FE4 fans, but I wish it was FE4 as well. Trust me. Anyways, my name is ZerkMonsterHunter 4, and as always, happy hunting.